I'm here today not to present a cautionary tale as much as an opportunity to see how these things play out in the U.S. context, so that when things from the U.S. start influencing you in your own practice, you can exercise some kind of judgment about how you want to react yourselves to what's occurring in your own context. So I'm going to try to address three different categories of change that are coming in Australia. Some of it's here, some of it's still a little bit on the horizon, but I will talk about both the literacy and numeracy tests. I'll talk about teacher performance assessment, and then at the end I'll talk about the consequences of these kinds of initiatives for accountability in teacher education programs run by universities like this one, or perhaps the one where you work. Before I begin, though, just given these three sets of new policy endeavors, briefly, what are your interests and concerns so that I can try to take them into account and address them as I work through today? I'll also pause at several points during the presentation for input, and then I'll stop at the end, hopefully in time for questions or conversation. So when you hear these terms, teacher numeracy and literacy testing, graduate teacher performance assessment, teacher education accountability, what issues or concerns does that bring to mind? Okay, well, let's dig in. Before we dig in, let me offer a couple of caveats. You gathered some of them from the introductions, but it's really important when we talk about these issues to realize that a lot of what you're being subjected to is transported to you from the US. But context really makes a difference. And I think it's important that we figure out how to take context into account as we contemplate these issues. Much of my expertise is US specific. Many of the legal issues in particular would play their way out quite differently here than they would in the United States. It's important to note that part of what's going on in the US now that I hope isn't happening here, and I hope you don't face, is there is an enormous groundswell, as you may have heard from the news, there's an enormous groundswell of criticism in the United States about higher education. It's too expensive, it's not successful in preparing people for careers, it is resulted in an unconscionable amount of student debt load, or debt load on the part of students and their parents, and much of that debt is bad debt, because a good bit of it was incurred to attend short-term, extremely expensive trade school where you actually have very little odds of getting a job. That, however, has painted itself over all of higher education in the United States. And it taints every one of the current considerations about accountability, and it's caused an enormous accountability thrust toward higher education institutions that I think colors the US context considerably. The other thing about the US context is we are crazy mad for data about institutions, and we love to be able now to go on the internet and find data about the teacher education program at Boston College and how successful it is in getting people jobs, how successful it is in terms of how well our students do on teacher performance, not teacher performance tests, teacher basic skills tests. And these aren't like your league tables, but they're very individual sorts of data sets that it is assumed the public want to see as they make their consumer choices about education institutions. And then the Obama administration has on the table, and has had for some period of time, a new set of proposals to regulate teacher education in particular, and to use outcomes data to make judgments about the quality of teacher education institutions. And that proposal's been sitting there. It's been highly controversial. There are rumors it'll be out any day. I've watched a lot of administrations come and go from Washington, and my suspicion is that they will drop that as they're on their way out the door. And then the question will become what the next White House administration will do with it. So that's a little bit more about the US context. And then I would say that my stance, as was indicated, is I'm a lawyer, or you would call them a barrister. I still advise other attorneys. I'm going to talk about some legal issues that I've worked behind the scenes on. I'm also often asked to work confidentially so people don't know I'm involved. But my stance is my training is in law. My PhD is in education, leadership, and policy. And what I've always been interested in is trying to help people understand how legal and public policy issues intersect with education research and practice. So that's the background I bring to this. The other thing I should say is that I was once an ed school dean, and I was in particular Dean of Education at Boston College at a time where I was told we either had to turn it around or close it down. So I know how hard change is in schools of education, and I know how it can work and how it doesn't work. I was very pleased when I left. We were ranked on our league tables as number 16 ed school in the country, which is not bad given that when I started they were going to shut it down 7 years earlier. The teacher performance, teacher testing issues call on a lot of expertise about teacher education. It's been a long time since I would call myself a teacher educator, but I have been involved heavily in consulting with states and with higher education institutions and with the Stanford University project that created the EdTPA that we'll be talking about in a little bit. So those are some of my background potential conflicts, potential biases. So it may help to start first by just refreshing your understanding or giving you a new understanding of how teacher testing, and I'm going to talk about teacher testing and then I'll talk separately about teacher performance assessment. By teacher testing, I'm referring to the kinds of basic skills assessment like your numeracy and literacy test that's now being implemented here. So in the United States, originally, these kinds of initiatives were begun at the behest of the higher ed community itself. And this was almost 100 years ago. And this was undertaken by the higher education community because of its concerns about teacher education. And the National Teacher Examination that was created at the behest of the American Council on Education was really there to try to take a measure of schools of education. It didn't really have individual consequences. It didn't really have institutional consequences in a direct, high-stakes way, but it was there as an information source. It became more critically important in the years beginning in the mid-20th century when the national teacher exam that had been originally a higher education idea was used to try to put up a screen as schools, particularly in our southern states, were responding to federal government obligations to racially desegregate themselves. At that point in time, the national teacher exam did have individual consequences. It was used to screen candidates to the teaching profession, and it, not surprisingly, had an enormous impact on African American teachers. It became heavily litigated, and a number of federal statutes were put in place at the same time, civil rights protection statutes. And the general principle that you could derive about that is that when an employment test, like the National Teacher Exam, is used for high-stakes purposes with an impact on individuals, if it has a disproportionately hazardous impact on minority group members, there's a special obligation on the part of those using the test to ensure that the test has high technical properties, particularly validity and reliability. And that principle of high technical properties in a high stakes use will become something that becomes important as we work our way through these issues as we proceed. Now, in the past 15 years or so, we've then developed these other kinds of approaches to the use of teacher testing, and that is teacher testing as a tool for education reform. The idea being that you need an external driver to influence ed school practices in particular and to ensure the quality of the individuals entering the profession. So teacher testing is used to address the problem with ed schools again. If we can impose these external mandates, maybe the ed schools will get better. Maybe we'll feel better about what it is they do. Welcome. Teacher testing is being used also through an argument that a test will professionalize teaching in the US. Med school graduates have to take a test. Law school graduates have to take a test. Ergo, a test must mean something is a professionalized endeavor. A loose analogy, don't hold me to it. I'm just repeating what people said. The third idea and this doesn't come out as clearly about the test itself, but it's clearly woven through this context, is the idea that there's a whole problem in the United States with teacher unions. And this is an initiative that's driven by a bunch of billionaires who have kind of hobby public policy projects that they do. And what they really are against is unionism broadly. But they pick teacher unionism as a way to chip away at the influence of unionization in the United States. So they've undertaken a number of advertising initiatives and lawsuits to try to attack teacher unions and the job protections that public school teachers in the United States have accrued as a result of unionization. Now, mind you, less than half of the states in the country have unionized teaching forces. But part of what's occurred, I think, as a side effect consequence of that anti-teacher union initiative is a huge decrease in respect for teaching in general. So teachers are not as respected as they used to be in my country. And the teaching profession, which was already in a bit of a dive in terms of participation when opportunities in the workplace were opened up for women in other fields, now teacher education is extremely unappealing in the United States. In a state like California, for example, the enrollments in teacher education programs have dropped by half in the past couple of years. And I think in part, I don't have a causal relationship, but in part this is embedded in this whole culture of how we think about teaching and how we try to regulate the teaching profession. So in the United States, every state gets to choose what to do about how it regulates the teaching profession. Every state runs its own licensure or certification system. Every state makes its own judgment about whether to use a teacher test or not, although the federal government is back there pushing them in certain directions. And as a result, there are a number of different kind of basic skills tests for teachers that are in operation in the United States today. So the Educational Testing Service, which had originally brought us the National Teacher Exam, which was the original endeavor, now has the Praxis series, which includes some basic skills kinds of testing, some subject matter testing. They are also in the performance assessment testing business that we'll be talking about in the later part of this presentation. So many states use Praxis. There is a Pearson company. Pearson, you all know Pearson, right? Everybody knows Pearson. There's a Pearson company, a company Pearson bought up, formerly called National Evaluation Systems, now called Evaluation Systems, a company that was a small company, but one that was in business for many years, offering so-called state customized teacher tests. They just had a shelf of items and they'd put them together in different booklets depending on what state you were from. And they had some very worrisome professional practices that were called out by some of the federal judges. I don't know whether it's a better company in terms of professional practice now or not, but I do note that they are involved potentially in what's going on here. So they're in some of the states. Some states develop their own tests. And then some states use ACT, which is primarily a higher ed admissions testing company in the United States. But they sell these other products. One is Work Keys, which isn't an education. It's not for teachers. It's kind of a general employment test. And it measures not only basic skills, but your personal attributes, shall we say. Whether you'd be a good employee in terms of your comportment, your personality, your behavior. So there are a wide range of possibilities here for what kinds of teacher tests can be in use and can be contested. Now, yes, there have been a lot of legal contests over these kinds of teacher tests used for hiring, used for licensing, used to make judgments about teacher education programs. So let me just quickly go through the kinds of legal issues that have come up in the US context. Not that you'll necessarily have these as legal issues, but each of these legal issues reflects a big public policy consideration about what, when, whether, and how you should test people. Some of the legal issues will be quite analogous. So one theory is there should be, when individuals confront a high-stakes decision about themselves, they should be entitled under the United States Constitution and most state constitutions to reasonable treatment by government. It should be fair, it shouldn't be arbitrary, it should be professional. You should know, you should be able to act with your government with some kind of assurance that it's going to treat you right, and if there's a problem, you get a chance to at least contest it or raise a question about it. So fair treatment by government seemed to me a really basic issue, one of fundamental fairness. The courts don't agree with me so much anymore. They will look askance at challenges based on reasonableness, which I'll talk about a little later on. Procedural protections have been an issue. As Joy mentioned, the same thing that came up on high school testing can come up in teacher testing. Was there enough notification ahead of time of the requirements you'd be held accountable for? Did you have a chance to prepare? Did you get the kind of support that you should get from your preparing institution? And can you challenge a decision that might have been made in error? Those are procedural protections. The most powerful, welcome, have a seat. One of the most powerful sets of protections are those involving protections against race, gender, ethnic discrimination. And those are, as I suggested earlier, very powerful because they embed in them the notion that once you can show disproportionately low performance on a test for members of a minority group, then there's an obligation on the part of the testing entity to take particular care to ensure the technical quality of the instrument and to ensure that the test isn't biased against those individuals. Limits on discrimination on the basis of disability. These statutes in the US are not dissimilar in many ways to those that are in effect in Australia, as I understand them in a very general way. There haven't been many court cases about this in the teaching context. They come up a lot around law examinations. I guess they learned something in law school. They learned how to sue people. The idea here is that you can impose requirements that differentiate against people and might sort people out because of disability. But you can only do that if you can establish that the disability bars someone from performing the essential functions of a job. The essential functions of a job. That's not an easy consideration for the teaching professions all the time. Must everyone be able to spell? Must everyone be able to see? Must everyone be able to lift heavy objects? We have our presumptions about things, but we don't necessarily have a clear idea of how to think about what really is essential for a given teacher, subject area, or for teaching in general. Is the platform for participating on a test accessible? There's an enormous problem in my country with the lack of accessibility to individuals with vision impairments for the online platforms that are being used in a lot of the teacher testing systems. Maybe you all are way better at that than we are. I'm impressed with the quality of technology at this university. But that's going to be a growing issue as more and more individuals with disabilities participate in the workplace, or participate in our higher education programs. Protection of religious freedoms. Are there items on the test or requirements that people are asked to meet? Are there test administration requirements that don't take into account religious holidays? Are there obligations to provide certain information that might in fact conflict with someone's deeply and real religious views? That one's also hypothetical, hasn't happened yet, and there has not been a lawsuit on the next one, but it hits particularly close at home, potentially for some of you. Free speech issues about whether faculty can resist these requirements because they intrude on their academic freedom. That's not what I teach. That's not what I think I should teach. That's not what you can obligate me to teach. Those controversies will exist. Again, they haven't been to court, but I've certainly heard plenty of them. There was a big kerfuffle about it in Rhode Island a while back. And then these two last issues have to do with this broader question of the protection under law for ensuring a quality of education in the sense that everyone has a fair opportunity to learn. How does this system fit within the idea that it promotes fair, meaningful opportunity to learn for elementary and secondary school students, but then also for tertiary students who are in teacher preparation programs. So these kinds of issues are lurking out there in the US context. These have been the issues that have had the most prominence in recent years. But then there's a new one that emerged that's basically what I call a consumer protection issue. So in the same way that people are all keen on getting information online about the quality of their educational institution so they can make sure that they spend their education dollars in the way they want their precious children to have that money spent, they're buying not an education the way I think we were all raised to believe it exists, making us a better person, fulfilling us, broadening our thinking. They're interested in a consumer product. They want a credential. They want the highest nameplate credential they can afford to buy. They want some degree of assurance of what they're getting when they purchase that credential. And when things go bad, how do they think about it when they look for a lawyer? It's just like buying a lemon at a car dealership. So some of the activity has occurred around this kind of consumerist idea that somebody got a bad education deal. Business attorneys, and they were used to representing people who had, fishermen who'd been subjected to toxic waste in their fishing waters. And they were using these consumer business approaches to challenge harms that had occurred in the business context. And what they argued was when there was a scoring error by the Educational Testing Service on the praxis tests, that was a bad consumer product situation. And within 24 hours after filing the lawsuit, within 24 hours, the Educational Testing Service offered to settle the case. The case was ultimately settled for millions of dollars, and those attorneys made $3 million in attorney's fees. I think that presents an interesting insight into how the consumers, quote unquote, of education may think about these things for the future. So I alert you to that for your consideration. Now, that's kind of the swirl of where things stand in the US. One thing that is clear in all of these considerations is that there's always lurking behind every one of these disputes some set of issues about the quality of the testing instruments that are being utilized. And there are, in the US system, federal and state laws that talk about those kinds of obligations. There are professional standards, the testing standards, that are developed in the US but are intended to address an international audience. They spell out the evidence base that needs to exist for any kind of a test or an assessment. And they make it very clear that the higher the stakes for the individual, the more this evidence that needs to be available. And this is about the validity and the reliability of the tests being used, how scores are set, how scoring occurs, how you determine what the pass point is on a teacher test, what kinds of obligations you have to ensure test security so there isn't inappropriate coaching to a test, what you do to ensure that there aren't breaches in the security of the test. All these kinds of issues are triggered by legal considerations, but they exist independently from the education research community, from the testing community. If you look at contracts for testing companies, they'll regularly say, we present you, we sell you a test that meets these requirements. It's almost boilerplate language in all those contracts. The question is, does it? And part of what you need to think about is how you assure yourselves as a community that the instruments in play in this country are in fact comfortable to you from this technical perspective. So let's talk a little bit about the land type. How can what's happened in the US illuminate how to think about the Australian context, this particular test that is now perilously close, right? Next week? How can we think about that? Well, when I looked at the land type documents, I sort of started with consideration of what the public policy goals are. Why is this being done? Why do public officials Important people say that this is necessary. Those kinds of goals are the goals against which the technical quality of the test needs to be measured, right? So the clarity of the goals and the way in which the goals are pursued become critically important. Well, what's the goal? Top 30% of the adult population in Australia, right? I read a lot of documents. I won't pretend to have read them all. I think there's an issue there. It's an unassailably appealing public policy quest, right? Teachers should be that good. How you get there and the technical defensibility of getting there is what's at issue in this context. There are many technical challenges associated with pursuing that goal. And you as a community greatly impacted by the implementation of that or the pursuit of that goal need to be assured as best you can that that goal is being pursued in a technically defensible way. What evidence do you have? What evidence do you need to look for? One of the things you might think about before you begin looking at that evidence is to be really clear about the extent of the impact of this test. It's going to impact potential candidates entering the teaching force. It's going to impact who completes the teacher education program and how much remediation you might have to offer them. It's going to impact the practices and curriculum of your teacher education programs. And you know, ideally, the whole point of the public policy goal was to make schools better for all the kids in Australia. So we want to think about whether this test is getting us there as well. What I encourage is a community discussion among the teacher education and public sector officials in your states and nationally about how land type fits or doesn't. And I didn't see the kind of technical quality documents I would have expected to see or hoped to see. But I would also admit that sometimes in the states I only saw those documents after I sued for them and got them through a court-ordered discovery process. You shouldn't need to do that, but maybe you might need to. And there are people who probably shouldn't have access to those technical documents because they don't have the expertise to understand them. But there needs to be as much public transparency and as much professional transparency as possible to stand behind those kinds of new initiatives. So that's teacher testing. That's the easy one. The harder one is what I call the next generation efforts to impact the teaching profession and to impact teacher education. The so-called disruptive innovation efforts. And these are the performance assessments. So this is when I felt like I wasn't so much Back to the Future 20 years ago as Back to the Future maybe 5. And then you all started speeding very rapidly to be on the same track as we were in terms of what you were up to, although you've not quite come as far as we have, but you're real close. So in the United States, we've had a history of teacher performance assessment efforts that have occurred over the past probably 15 years, maybe a little bit longer. And again, because states get to choose how to regulate themselves and their teaching professions, these efforts began initially in just 2 states, Connecticut and California. So California has the PAC, the Performance Assessment for California Teachers, and that had been going on for a period of time. And then in the US, our state's highest education officials get to have an association where they get together regularly, and then they have staffs who get together regularly. That's called the Council of Chief State School Officers, or the CCSSO. They had a long-running project that went back maybe 20 or 25 years called InTask. They began conversations then through that forum about implementing teacher performance assessment. And the State Association, and then now more recently, the Association of Colleges of Teacher Education in the States have now embraced what is the EdTPA. And the EdTPA is the most prominent example of teacher performance assessment in the United States. And it really came out of the old California program. It's the same people, a lot of the same processes and components of the assessment. And EdTPA is a Stanford University project which has now been given to Pearson to administer and score. So instrumental in all these performance assessment efforts was the influence of Linda Darling Hammond, who's just recently retired from Stanford. She has doggedly for decades been pursuing a goal of trying to get teaching professionalized in the United States. And this is her thoughtful response to how to impact in some ways the quality of the teaching force. She is also she's rated regularly as the most influential education researcher in the United States. So when Linda comes up with something, people tend to listen. My general view of her is that she does very high quality work. She and I disagree on some very fundamental things that are not really important for this discussion, but she has had a singular influence on the movement away from these kind of basic numeracy, literacy skills tests approach to the use of performance assessment. So how does the use of EdTPA play out in the US context? Well, as you might guess from what I said earlier about how things have been going in the United States, it caused a boatload of controversy, particularly among teacher education types. So there are lots of goals for EdTPA. One of them is to professionalize. The other is to treat the teaching credential to practice as a license as opposed to a certificate. It's intended, EdTPA is intended to change the practice of teacher education programs. It's intended to be embedded within teacher education to influence curriculum, instruction, practica. It's intended to impact and improve elementary and secondary education, especially for the most at-risk elementary and secondary school kids. And the idea also is that by pursuit and utilization of the EdTPA, you can both directly and indirectly improve the public's perception of teachers and the teaching force, public's faith in teaching. The legal issues could be all the same kinds of legal issues that arose in the earlier part of my discussion concerning teacher testing. The technical challenges, however, are greater. There are still the same professional standards requirements for validity, reliability, test security, integrity, etc. But here you have an additional set of challenges associated with who does the scoring and how they do the scoring. And this becomes a particular issue when EdTPA administration and scoring was outsourced to Pearson, which is a for-profit company that, it's a for-profit company. So they do things like move from 2 scores to 1. So one person scores the EdTPA, that's it. You can contest that if you don't like the outcome of your score, but one person scores. They do some read-behinds to try to ensure the integrity of the scoring. And they say that the scores are either teacher education faculty or experienced teachers. Now, they solicit me all the time to score, and I know a few things, but I wouldn't be inappropriately qualified scorer in my view. I think they may be having trouble finding scores. And they impose on their scores a non-disclosure contract. So if you score, you cannot come back to your ed school and talk with your ed school colleagues or talk to your elementary and secondary school colleagues about what happened in the administration experience, which I think creates a problem for trying to use the assessment to infuse itself back into the practice of higher education programs if you can't talk about what it is. other than to know what it requires. Knowing how it's scored is the real key. That means that these technical issues and these efforts to use the EdTPA release what I call sort of a new set of next generation legal problems, new kinds of problems. So we have the old common problems about discrimination, fairness in treatment, et cetera. But now we have a whole series of new kinds of issues that are legal and ethical about privacy. How do you protect the privacy of the teachers who are submitting these portfolios? More important, how do you protect the privacy of the school children whose student work is included in the portfolios and videotapes of whom are also submitted as part of the performance assessment? Can you ensure that the kids' privacy rights in those schools are protected? What can you do to ensure that someone doesn't, the selfie generation, they want to post this on their Facebook page. They're going to put it on YouTube. What can you do to ensure candidates participating in these assessments protect privacy, in addition to having the assessment system protect the privacy of the candidates going through the assessment? In the US, we have lots of statutes that are actually meant for the criminal context, but they have to do with the conditions under which you can secretly record people. It's called wiretapping. If you watch crime shows on TV, you're familiar with the concept. There are some possibilities that if you don't do this right, your candidate engaging in a performance assessment could be violating criminal wiretapping laws. So you want to make sure that bit of messiness is not going to happen. In the US, we have statutes that protect the privacy of student records information under federal law. There's no way to enforce it really, but we have those laws. And so do we train our future teachers on these privacy obligations? And do we ensure they comply with them when they submit these performance assessments? And then to make it more complicated, of course, there are also state privacy laws that come into play. And then part of this reform initiative is associated, this is not Linda Darling-Hammond's idea, but in the context, it's associated with the use of these big data warehouses where we can keep all kinds of data about all sorts of performance metrics, about all kinds of things, and use big data to make our practice better. These go to outside vendors to maintain in the US. There are all kinds of security, digital privacy rights associated with those warehouses. Sometimes they're pretty straightforward warehouses, like, we're just giving you a dashboard that you can get data and run your school better. But I don't know what kind of data warehouse Pearson has. They sure sell a lot of product of a lot of different sorts. Did they get into this business so they could include these kind of teacher performance data into their warehouse to use for some other purpose? I don't know, but it's worth wondering about as you think about how this is going to roll out in Australia. We also have a set of issues about what really, under law, does the public have a right to know about what's going on in education. How much of it should be transparent and available to the public, and how much of it is private and shouldn't be used to intrude upon the individual determinations about whether Joy or I could teach X, right? So that is another consideration in the US context. And the place that's come most into play is there is in the US, and it must be going on here as well, a whole new generation of journalists whose goal is to use data as part of journalism, to try to access existing data sets and use them journalistically in telling stories about what's going on in fields like healthcare or education. So there have been actually a series of court cases about how state laws would or would not allow journalists to have access to data in these data warehouses. And then the other predicted set of other next generation issues are those that come from this kind of consumerist frame of mind. So it's all about products, it's all about business. So who owns the intellectual property in the performance assessment folder? Who owns it? Does a teacher own it? Does a future teacher own it? Does the higher ed professor who helped the teacher develop that have some intellectual ownership? Does Pearson own it when they get it to score? All of this is unclear. In some school districts, they actually have a union contract that clarifies who owns teacher work product. But it's increasingly important because you can go on the web and find, either for free or for sale, all kinds of stuff that would be keen to put in your performance assessment portfolio. It wouldn't necessarily be your work, but so lots of intellectual property issues. These kind of issues that came up in the Praxis misscoring about how you go about trying to redress your complaint if you feel your performance assessment wasn't handled right, present all these issues in business law about contracts, misrepresentation, fraud. I don't know about Australia, but in the US, another issue I've seen emerge is we have a federal law called a whistleblower statute. If you see some misconduct in the expenditure of federal government funds, you have evidence of misconduct of federal funds, you can blow the whistle on that. That's for the public good. But if you actually prevail in establishing that that fraud occurred, that misuse of federal funds occurred, you can get a reward, 30% of the penalty. It can be millions of dollars. There are whole boutique law firms that specialize in whistleblower cases in the US. We had a test cheating situation in the Washington, D.C. public schools, and one of the first groups of people outside the educators and the politicians that got involved, a little boutique law firm that specialized in whistleblower cases. Didn't go anywhere, but they were dipping their toes in the waters. And then, there's the possibility of criminal charges. We have a few former, sadly, a few former superintendents of schools who are in prison in the US for promoting fraud in testing situations. It wasn't teacher testing, it wasn't teacher performance assessment, but it was student elementary and secondary school testing where there were high stakes consequences for a superintendent's job or their district as a result of testing programs. So these things have happened as well. So here's how the fallout plays out in the education community. Those are all the legal issues. As I alluded to earlier, some of my colleagues on higher education faculties are immensely upset for understandable reasons that this is just too much of an intrusion on their academic freedom. And it does indeed impact their day-to-day practice, or it should. I actually wrote a paper in which I said, I've looked at academic freedom, and this seems, as a legal matter, and this seems the sort of situation where an individual professor's preference would not prevail. If the state mandates, or if the federal government mandates a certain curriculum, a professor has to teach it in this kind of teacher preparation context where you're engaging in a higher education endeavor that's so heavily regulated by government. If you were the Italian professor, maybe you could complain, but probably not the teacher ed professor. There have been concerns about the EdTPA Pearson scoring, concerns about the fact that before Pearson got involved, the scores were 2 rather than 1, and a concern about just Pearson. It's just about Pearson. In my country, you can say Pearson, and lots of people in the room who know about education have feelings about it that are quite dearly held. It's a big business. So some people are just not happy about the Pearson part, but they also have a policy argument that this is another example of sort of the corporatization of education in our country. Just another way in which the professionals' judgments and determinations have been taken over by some outside private for-profit entity. So for some of those faculty complaining about it, this is just another example of corporatization, of which there are many in the US at this point in time. And then finally, of course, a new coaching industry grew up. So if you go online, some of the websites were dead when I checked them the other day, so perhaps someone is hustling on this. You can find online an EdTPA coaching service. And you can use that to help you put together your performance assessment portfolio. Now, whatever you think about that, one way or the other, that's an issue we have to figure out how to cope with. Because in an ideal world, if you graduate from an approved teacher education program, you should not need a coach. But they will be out there, and one needs to figure out how to deal with them. So the last thing I want to make sure we get on the table is the use of these kinds of tools to ensure accountability in higher education. How are these tools being used to not only change higher education, but to hold it accountable? Publicly accountable, transparently accountable, accountable in a way that we can not only try to influence what people do in higher education, but we can turn to the public and say, here's what's going on. So I'm not aware of any state using EdTPA results to publicly provide data about what's going on in higher education institutions. It's only a matter of time before that happens, given how this is all folding out. It's only a matter of time before that happens. What we do have are a lot of public reporting indicators pushed really hard by the Obama administration, but also done in individual states, public accounting indicators for teacher performance tests. So if you had a child who was going to consider a teacher education program at Boston College, I've never checked this, so I'm not sure if it actually is there. It better be. You could go to the university website, you could go to the ed school section of the website, you should be able to see the data on how well our students do on teacher tests, more traditional kinds of teacher tests. That's an obligation imposed by the federal government. And you have to comply with that if you want students attending your university, any of your students in any program, if you want those students attending your university to be able to participate in federal student loan programs, or if anybody in your institution wants to participate in any federally funded programs, you have to make student-teacher test available for your institution publicly. What's in contest right now is whether we can make attributions about the quality of our teacher education programs by using value-added models or student growth measures. So these became very trendy in the Obama administration. The Gates Foundation put a lot of money into it. States were compelled to get involved in these student growth value-added model systems in elementary and secondary education. And the basic, should I give a little thumbnail sketch of how these work? Okay, so these are complicated statistical algorithms that take student test score data from K-12 students, elementary and secondary students, and use those data weighted slightly by perhaps some demographic variables. There are a lot of different ways to do these, many of them proprietary, so completely untransparent to us. You use these algorithms to measure growth over time of student populations, or the value added by a school or an educator as a result of students spending time with those educators by comparing student scores from one point in time to another. The test scores used are generally the basic skills tests that states required in the basic subjects given in not all years of a student's career. So it might be 3, 5, 7, 11, 10, whatever. But to take these data and use them to make a determination about whether the students who appeared in front of a teacher for a year actually had their test scores increased as a result of being with that teacher. That sounds great. Isn't that what every parent would want? I can actually know whether this teacher can raise kids' scores if they spend a year in her classroom. It sounds awesome. It's a really hot policy concept in the US. I thought it was completely indefensible. It's just so overwhelmingly appealing. It just sounds right. But here are the problems. Those tests we give, that we use to put in the algorithms to generate the scores about teacher contribution or school building contribution, they don't test all the kids. They don't test all the subjects. They don't test all the grades. They don't test kids with limited English proficiency. They don't test a lot of kids with disabilities. We actually only have those scores for 30% of the teachers in the country. But we could do some statistical manipulation. We could do some attributions. And we can actually give you a score, even though no child in your school ever participated in the testing system. It's so popular that now what we want to do, what the Obama administration has proposed, is that we'll do the same thing, because now we've got trackers on individual kids, individual teachers. We know where the teachers got their teacher preparation. We know which university they went to. We can backwards map, and we can make a judgment about the quality of my teacher education program at Boston College based upon how my graduates did when they left Boston College as alums and went to a school district and taught these kids for whom we're going to attribute test scores. They can then trace that back to my program at Boston College and say Boston College has these kinds of indicators of the quality of the teachers they prepare. Now, I have no quarrel at all with the desire to try to make me and my colleagues more accountable in a more measurable way. But the attribution links that you have to make to get from a kid in my class to graduation to a job in a school district, probably on the other end of the country because most of our alums go somewhere else to teach, teaching a bunch of kids in a school, well, that's going to come back to me at Boston College for a judgment about how well I'm doing. This is what's in the Obama administration proposal right now, and this is what's so contested about how the US federal government can regulate teacher education programs by making them more accountable for what they do. So again, I don't disagree with the goal of accountability. It's just the tool they're using is highly contested. So part of what I worry about, for your sakes, is what's going to happen in the Australian context, given what's happened in the US context, and given that you appear to be using a US model to pursue what it is you're trying to do to improve teaching. And if you ask any of the faculty who served under me as a dean, I was the worst critic of the quality of teacher education they'd probably ever seen. So I'm not defending teacher education, but I am suggesting that we have a lot of work to do as communities of government officials, communities of teacher educators, communities of elementary and secondary school practice. We have a lot to do, and we need to do fairly urgently to figure out how to situate ourselves in these debates. Note, the American Colleges for Teacher Education has now included in its accreditation requirements those student graduate score attributions out to the districts where student graduates ultimately work. So it has been embraced by part of the teacher education profession already. It's not been implemented, but it's been embraced. So what can I recommend? Early retirement? What can I recommend? There are a lot of issues here, and these are only illustrations of how they, mine are only illustrations of how they played out in one context. I think Linda Darling-Hammond was brilliant in coming up with the determination that you could use teacher performance assessment to change the profession and to change teacher education. And I haven't asked lately how she feels about how it's going, but part of what I think we have to recognize is we do need to improve ourselves. We do need to substantially improve ourselves. We do need to be more publicly accountable. And we do need to recognize that teacher educators, whatever kind of university you work in, and educators, no matter what kind of school you work in, owe the public evidence that we're promoting the common good. But to go back to the Future movie metaphor, one of the really keen things about those movies is you got these ideas during the 1980s when they were produced. You got these ideas of what the future might be in the year 2015. And some of it was disturbing, but some of it was really awesome. And one of the things that I remember from that movie is one of the things that I thought when I saw that movie was really awesome was the hoverboard. You know, he was hovering around everywhere on this hoverboard. In 2015, we actually had hoverboards. The problem was they spontaneously burst into flames or exploded. To what extent are these initiatives going to be like that? Or to what extent can the teacher education and the education professions work collaboratively to try to make sure these become useful tools that could actually improve education practice? That's the question, that's the challenge, that's the quest. And I wish you all the very best success in whatever iteration this takes, where you are, and I'm happy to address further questions.